Sewing needle. It is said that Yu Xiaoxi, a native of Dongzhang, was engaged in business. My wife, Jia, came back from her parents' home one day and walked to the door of her house. She saw an old lady and a girl crying very sadly. Jia asked curiously why, and the old lady told her with tears. It turned out that the old lady's husband was named Wang Shenzai, and he was originally a descendant of an official. Later, his family declined and he could no longer make a living. So he begged for guarantees and borrowed money from the wealthy Huang family to do business. On the way, he encountered robbers and robbed all his money. Fortunately, he escaped home with his life. Huang asked for debts every day, totaling more than 30 taels of silver including principal and interest. His family really had nothing to repay the debts. Huang spied on Wang Shenzai's daughter and wanted to get it as a concubine. Asked the guarantor to tell Wang Shenzai if he is willing to use his daughter to pay the debt. In addition to writing off the original debt, he will give another 20 taels of silver. Wang Shenzai couldn't make up his mind and went to discuss it with his wife. The wife cried and said, "Although we are poor, we are also descendants of an official family. How dare Huang make his fortune by being a slave? So how dare he let my daughter be his mistress? Besides, Sewing Needle already has a son-in-law. You can't do it without permission. Make the decision." Previously, Fu Zhen's son from this county had a good relationship with Wang Shenzai and gave birth to a son, named Mao, so the two families arranged a baby marriage. Later, Fu Zhen went to Fujian to become an official and died in office more than a year ago. Since his wife and children could not return to their hometown, they had no contact with the Wang family. Therefore, when Xianzhen was 15 years old, she was still not married. When his wife mentioned this matter, Wang Shenzai was speechless and sighed, thinking about how to repay Huang's debt. The wife said, "If there is nothing else I can do, I will go back to my parents' home to discuss it with my two brothers and ask them for help." Wang Shenzai's wife's surname was Fan. Her grandfather had been an official in the capital. She had two grandsons, and her family was rich in land. The next day, Mrs. Fan returned to her parents' home with her daughter sewing needles and begged her two younger brothers for help. However, the two younger brothers allowed her to cry sadly without even saying a word to help. Fan was helpless and came back crying. When Jia asked about it, she started talking and crying again. After hearing this, Jia felt very sorry for the mother and daughter. Seeing that the girl was born soft and cute, I felt even more sad. He invited the mother and daughter to his home and entertained them with wine and food. He comforted them and said, "Don't be sad, you too. I will try my best to help you." Before Mrs. Fan could thank her, her daughter was already crying and fell to her knees. Jia felt even more pity for her and said thoughtfully, "Although I have a little savings, it is difficult to come up with 30 taels of silver, so I have to rely on pawning things to raise money. Mother and daughter thank you again and again." Jia agreed with them to withdraw the money after 3 days. After Fan's mother and daughter left, Jia tried every means to raise money, but she did not dare to tell her husband. 3 days later, he still hadn't collected 30 taels of silver, so he sent someone back to his parents' home to borrow money from his mother. At this time, Fan's mother and daughter had arrived. Jia told them the truth and asked them to come back the next day. In the evening, after the money was borrowed, Jia wrapped the money together with the original pieces and placed them on the bedside. At night, a robber penetrated the wall and entered the house with a lamp. Jia woke up with a start, opened her eyes slightly, and saw a man with a short knife on his arm, who looked very ferocious. Jia was very frightened and pretended to be asleep, not daring to express her anger. The robber approached the box as if he wanted to pick the lock. When he turned around, he found a small package next to Xia's pillow. He reached over and grabbed it, opened it under the lamp, looked at it, and put it into his pocket. He stopped opening the box and left. Jia quickly stood up and called for help. There was only one little girl at home. When she heard the shouting, she hurriedly went to greet her neighbors through the wall. By the time the neighbors came running over, the robber had already disappeared. Jia lost her silver and cried in front of the lamp, feeling that she could not explain to Fan and her daughter. Seeing that the little girl was already asleep, he hung himself on the window lattice. At daybreak, the girl found Jia hanging and called for help in fear. When he was rescued, his limbs were already cold. When Yu Shaoxi heard the news, she hurried home and asked the little girl. Only then did she learn what had happened, and she cried bitterly to attend the funeral. It was summer, and Xia's body was neither stiff nor rotting. It took 7 days before I entered Lian. After the burial, Liaozhai secretly ran out of the house and went to Xia's grave to cry bitterly. While he was crying, suddenly there was a thunder and lightning. Heavy rain poured down, and a thunderbolt exploded the Jia family's grave, and the sewing needle was also shocked to death. When Yu Shaoxi heard about it, he rushed to his wife's grave to check and saw that the coffin had been opened and his wife was moaning inside. So she hurriedly took her out. I saw a female corpse next to me, but I didn't know who it was. When Jia woke up and looked carefully, she recognized it as a sewing needle. The two of them were shocked and surprised. After a while, Mrs. Fan ran over and found that her daughter was dead. She cried and said, "I suspected she was here." And it was true. After hearing the news of Mrs. Xia's death, she cried day and night. "Tell me tonight if she wants to come." I didn't agree to cry and offer sacrifices at the grave, so she came here by herself. Mrs. Jia was moved by the friendship between Zhen and told her husband about it, and buried Zhen in her own coffin and tomb. Thank you, Fan. Yu Shaoxi carried his wife back home, and Fan also went back to tell her husband about passing by. At this time, I heard someone say that a man in the north of the village was struck by lightning and died on the road. There were also words written on his body, "The thief who stole Xia's money." After a while, I heard the neighbor's wife wailing. Only then did she realize that the robber killed by thunder was her husband Martha. Someone in the village hurriedly reported it to the government, and the government arrested Mata's wife for questioning, and then learned the whole story. It turned out that Mrs. Fan cried and told others with gratitude because Mr. Jia agreed to pay for her to redeem her daughter. Ma Daban was a rogue gambler. After hearing about this, he came up with the idea of stealing Xia's money. The government took the woman to her house to search for stolen goods. Only 20 taels of silver were found. For more taels were found from Ma Da's body. The government decided to sell Ma's wife, collect the stolen money, and return it to Yu Shaoxi. Jia liked it even more and still gave the money to Fan in full, asking her to return it to her creditor. 3 days after the burial, a sudden strong wind roared at night. Lightning and thunder shook the tomb open again, and the needle came to life. She didn't go home and went straight to knock on Xia's door. It turns out that Yanjun recognized that the place where she was buried was Xia's grave, so she suspected that she had been resurrected. Jia woke up when she heard a knock on the door and asked who it was through the door. Liaozhai said, "Is Madam really alive?" "I am Liaozhai." When Jia heard this, she was horrified and thought it was a ghost. I hurriedly called the neighbor's old lady to ask about it. And then I found out that the sewing needle was really alive again, and I happily let her into the house. Lamai said to Mr. Jia, "I am willing to stay and serve my wife. I don't want to go home again." Jia said, "Don't you suspect that I paid for slaves? After you were buried, I paid off your family's debt. Please don't be suspicious." Liaozhai became more and more grateful and cried, wanting to recognize Mrs. Jia as her mother. Jia didn't agree, and Liaozhai begged, "My daughter can do housework, and she won't be an idle earner." After daybreak, Jia went to tell Fan about Liaozhai's resurrection. Mrs. Fan was overjoyed and hurried over. She also obeyed her daughter's wishes and asked her daughter to worship Jia as her mother. After Fan returned home, Jia sent Yan Zhenchang back home. Liaozhai cried and missed Mrs. Jia. Wang Shenzai carried his daughter to Xia's house, put her inside the door and laughed. When Jia saw the sewing needle, she was surprised and asked her how she came about. After learning the reason, she felt relieved and accepted her daughter. When Yanjun saw Yu Shaoxi coming, he hurriedly bowed down and called him father. Yu Shaoxi had no children to begin with, but she was very happy when she saw the beautiful needle. From then on, sewing needles, spinning threads, weaving, sewing and mending clothes, working very hard. Once, Jia fell ill by chance, and Jiazhen served him day and night. Seeing that Jia didn't eat, he didn't eat either. His face was often stained with tears, and he told people, "If anything happens to my mother, I will never live again." After Xia's illness improved, the sewing needle was revealed, smiled. When Jia heard about it, she cried and said, "I am over 40 and have no children. If I can give birth to a daughter, I will be satisfied." Jia had never given birth, but a year later, she suddenly gave birth to a son. People say this is the reward for doing good deeds. 2 more years passed, and the sewing needle got bigger and bigger. Yu Shaoxi discussed with Wang Xinzai that they could not stick to their past engagement with the Fu family. Wang Xinzai said, "My daughter is in your home, and all marriage matters are up to you." Yanjun was 17 years old, virtuous and beautiful, unparalleled in the world. As soon as the news of her marriage came out, the people who came to propose marriage broke the threshold. Yu Shaoxi and his wife were picking and choosing, trying their best to choose a satisfactory son-in-law. Wealthy Huang also sent a matchmaker to propose marriage. Yu Shaoxi was disgusted by his unkindness for being rich and resolutely refused, choosing instead the son of the Feng family. Feng was originally a famous person in the county. His son was smart and wrote well. Yu Shaoxu told Wang Xinzai the results of his choice, but Wang went out to do business and did not come back. Yu Shaoxi took matters into her own hands and made a marriage arrangement with the Feng family. Huang failed, so he went out to do business under the guise of going out to do business. He found Wang Xinzai, hosted a banquet for him, and even subsidized him with some capital. The two gradually became harmonious, and Huang boasted about how smart his son was and wanted to act as a matchmaker to propose marriage to his son. Wang Xinzai was grateful for Huang's help and admired his wealth, so he agreed. After returning home, "Go tell Yu Shaoxi. Yu had accepted the marriage certificate from the Feng family yesterday." After hearing what Wang Xinzai said, he was very unhappy and asked his daughter to come out and tell her the situation. The daughter said angrily, "The Huang creditors are our enemies, let me serve them, and I will die." Wang Xinzai was ashamed and asked someone to tell Huang that Yu Shaoxi had agreed to the Feng family's marriage. Huang was furious and said, "That woman's surname is Wang, not you. I made a promise first, but he proposed marriage later. How could he break the promise?" So he filed a complaint with the county government. The county magistrate wanted to award the sewing needle to the Huang family because of Huang's previous appointment. The Feng family was dissatisfied and said, Wang Xinzai entrusted his daughter to the Yu family, and said personally that the Yu family would make the final decision on marriage matters. Besides, I have an engagement letter, and Huang and Wang just had a few drunken conversations. The county magistrate after hearing this, "I couldn't make a decision for a while, so I wanted to let the sewing needle do what it wanted." Huang quickly bribed the county magistrate with a large amount of money, begging him to favor him. Therefore, the matter has been delayed for more than a month without a final decision. One day, a scholar went north to Beijing to take the exam. He passed by Dongchang on a bus and was sent to inquire about Wang Xinzai. He happened to ask about the Yu family. Yu Shaoxi asked the person who came, and learned that the person's surname was Fu, who was a Mao back then. He had become a Fujian citizen and passed the provincial examination at the age of 18. Because she had a previous engagement with the Wang family, she never got married. This time when he was going north to take the exam, his mother specifically asked him to stop by and check the whereabouts of the Wang family and find out if Yanjun was married. Yu Shaoxi was overjoyed when she heard about it. Invite Fujian into his home. Describes in detail what the sewing needle has experienced over the years, but the son-in-law came from thousands of miles away and had no credentials. Fu Mao opened a box and took out the marriage certificate given by the Wang family. Yu Shaoxi hurriedly called Wang Xinzai and checked it, and it was indeed good. Everyone is happy. On this day, the county magistrate reviewed the needle case. Mao put in a famous post, met with the county magistrate, explained the situation, and the county magistrate dismissed the case. Mao arranged a wedding date with the Wang family and continued northward. Soon, Mao came back from participating in the examination. I bought a lot of gifts, stayed in his old home, and got married to the sewing needle. At this time, the good news that Mao passed the Jinshi examination had already arrived in Fujian. and then came to Dongzhang, where he passed the joint examination again, and then went to Beijing to observe politics. After returning from the capital, the needle does not want to go to the south. Because the ancestral graves of his old house were all here, Amao went south to pick up his father's coffin, cut it in a car, and moved his mother to his hometown together. A few years later, Yu Shaoxi passed away, and his son was only 7 or 8 years old. Yanjun raised him better than his biological brother, and allowed him to study and enter the county school. The family is also very wealthy, and all this is due to Amao's strength.
Alright, this story has come to an end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.